Okay, so this part of our tutorial is just going to be a very short part on optional variables. So all we're going to do is we're going to discuss what they are and how we can use them. And this is something that's unique to Swift. They are just basically variables that we can assign to contain the value nil, but we'll talk about them in a little more detail. Alright, so the last thing we'll be talking about is going to be a short tutorial on optional variables. Now what I mean by that is that optional variables are variables that can contain the value of nil. Okay, and this could be useful for running tests. Now let me show you an example. We'll first just create a regular variable, we'll call it some variable, and we'll declare it a type, so let's give this a type integer, and we'll just give it some value such as 400. Okay, so this is fine. If we then go to print out some variable, then we know it should contain the value 400 as soon as this updates. There we go. So we get 400 and 400. That's because we assigned the value here, and we're just printing out here. And we can even reassign it a value here and have it take on a new value. Now, to make a variable optional, we just put a question mark after the type. Okay? So now this is an optional variable. It has the question mark here, and it could contain the value nil, except it doesn't because we've assigned it a value. So if we take this away, then we get the value nil appearing. And if we were to just print out some variable without assigning it a value, we get nil also. Okay? That's because this is an optional variable. It has the question mark, whereas without that question mark, we get nothing. Okay? I'm just going to wait for this to update so we can see that. Okay, so if we put the question mark there, it is an optional variable. Now the difference is that if we want to declare it nil down here, we can, and there will be no problems. But if we didn't assign it to be optional, then we do get an error here. And that's because nil cannot be assigned to this type. Okay? So if we want to redeclare it to be nil, we would have to do something like this. We could give it a value of, in this case, 400, and declare it optional, and then declare it nil later on if we want. Or we won't be able to declare it nil at all. If we do this, then we can't declare it nil. Okay, so those are just optional variables. They're useful for running tests, so we can do something like this. We could say if some variable equals nil, then we could have something happen, but if statements are something for a different tutorial. Okay, so this is basically what an optional variable is. It contains the question mark, that makes it optional, and that allows us to reassign it to contain the value nil. If there's no question mark, then we cannot assign it to contain the value nil. If we assign it a value up here, then it takes on this value. If there is no value, then it's automatically initialized to be nil. And that's basically all there is to these optional variables. Once we get into if statements, we can talk about explicitly unwrapping these optional variables, but that's something for a different set of tutorials. Otherwise, this has been the end of our variables tutorial. I hope you learned a lot. We'll do a short recap video, and yeah, and that will be it. Alright, so this has been our intro into optional variables. We just discovered that they are variables that can contain the value nil if we haven't yet assigned a value to them. And you cannot later assign a variable to contain the value of nil unless it's an optional variable. We'll talk about how to basically unwrap these optional variables later, but that's a different topic for a different tutorial. Okay, so this is the final part of our tutorial. We're just going to do a brief wrap up and a summary here. So to summarize what we learned, we talked about how to assign variables. So for a start, we're going to look at variables. So this is going to be type var for variable, and we can give it a name, new name, and we can assign it a type if we want, such as integer, and give it a value of 56 or something, or we can have, let's just say variable 2, and actually I'm going to change this to variable 1. And this one we don't have to give a type. We can have it say hello or something, and it's fine either way. So I guess we should put the equals there. So yeah, there we go. We get 56 and we get hello. So we can either give a type or we can leave that blank. I would recommend trying to give a type as much as you can until you really get the hang of this. Okay, we also looked at constants. So let mammoth contain the string mammoth interactive. Okay, and so we can do something like that, in which case we cannot change the values. Okay, and this was a big difference we saw between variables and constants. So anything that's variable can be changed later on in the code. So if we want, we could say variable 1 now equals 20, and that's fine to do. Whereas we couldn't say, this should be mammoth, we couldn't say that we couldn't reassign the value of mammoth to contain anything other than the string that it currently does, because it's a constant. Okay, so the types we looked at were, we looked at booleans. These I'm just going to put in comments here. We looked at booleans, which are true or false. We looked at integers, which are basically numbers that have no decimal places. We looked at floats and doubles, which are numbers with decimals. We looked at characters and strings, which are basically ways to represent letters, numbers, or symbols in the code without having them take on their real values, let's just say. So for example, a 1 in a string is not considered to be a number, so we couldn't add it to, let's say, 5. Whereas if 1 was outside of a string, it's considered to be a number. Okay? So booleans good for true or false when there's only one of two options. Integers are good for non-decimal numbers. Floats and doubles best for decimal numbers. Characters and strings are good for storing symbols or letters or numbers without them taking on their real values, or to represent text within a code. So good for also changing stuff like text fields. Okay, so we looked at each of these, went through what they are, we looked at some examples, and then we finished off with optional variables, where we have something like variable 3, and let's give this a type integer. And this was an optional variable, so it contains a value nil right now, and we could reassign it if we want. So variable 3 equals 50 or something, and that's fine. We just couldn't do something like this. We couldn't later assign the value of nil to something that is not already optional. So in order to make that okay, we have to give it the optional value. Okay, so that's optional variables, and this is basically variables in a nutshell. If there are still parts that you're confused about, I recommend that you go through and watch that part again. And otherwise, thank you so much for watching our tutorial. Really enjoyed teaching you guys about variables, and hopefully you'll check out our other tutorials. If not, thank you for watching anyway, and if you do, I will see you in those videos. Alright, thanks guys.